I'm Dunham Biles,
Hi, I'm Jeremy Wilson.
and this is the best of the best, brought to you by Biles Wilson.
You know, Dunham, you can't look anywhere these days without hearing the term big data and the way it's transforming industries, and especially now with these large language models that can interface with the data like ChatGPT. It kind of seems to be revolutionizing all sorts of businesses, and we've seen a little bit of that in our business, in our legal practice. As you know, we recently got an AI legal research software, and it's amazing because you can take tens of thousands of cases, and this thing can you ask it a question in real language, and like an associate that might take a couple of hours to find the answer to a question, spits it out in 5-10 minutes, and it's remarkably accurate. So I'm really excited about kind of the topic today that we're going to be talking about.
Oh, as well as I am, and as you know, we very much love our AI research. It never talks back to us. It never disagrees with what we ask it to do, and it spits out an answer. But today, fortunately, we're here, and we're joined by our good friend, client, and future collaborator, Evan Anderson. Thank you for being here, Evan.
Yeah, pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
And Evan, I think we'd like to at least cover three things if we can today. And first, just for the sake of the audience, we need to let them know a little bit about who you are, your background. Then we want to talk about how you're using big data to interrupt change, how hard assets are acquired and valued and so forth. And then perhaps I know from our experience working together and your experience in school and otherwise, other litigation, that you have some interesting thoughts about the practice of law and litigation. So with that, can you just tell us a little bit about your basic background? I know you grew up in Montana and Oklahoma. So
Yeah, spent a lot of time in Montana and Oklahoma. Went to school out east. I'm a Duke graduate. Studied kind of an interdisciplinary major between genetics, political science, and law. Took a lot of classes from law professors as an undergrad, mostly constitutional law. I found it to be super creative and interesting. My interest, the reason why it was genetics, law, and policy at that time were because they just finished coding the human genome when I was in high school. Sure. You had the movie Gattaca with Jude Law that came out. Yep. Everybody was talking about, similar to LLM, everybody was talking about, how crazy genetics research was going to be in terms of gene enhancement versus gene therapy. Sure. And oftentimes when you get carried away with technology, policy and law tends to lag, right?
Sure.
The subject matter experts that are out there developing these sorts of technologies, push it to the market, consumers start running with it, and all of a sudden we hadn't stopped to thought about these ethical considerations, like what's the difference between gene enhancement and gene therapy? How do we feel about creating artificial organs and things like that, head transplants, all sorts of crazy stuff.
Yeah, right.
And I was just really fascinated by those questions, and wondering, how do you go from technology and research to policy and law. And so that's, where my interests were. I also played baseball out there. And so, that's kind of how I split my time in undergrad. And then there was a family tragedy that brought me back to Oklahoma and got me into the oil and gas industry. So my plan at that time was to stay out east and go to law school. I was less interested on the medical research side and more interested in the legal side. And that was initially the plan, and then life doesn't really care and throws you a curveball.
Sure. Ended
up back in the Midwest and got into oil and gas with no family connections to oil and gas. Again, I was fascinated by contract law. I spent my time at the OCU Law Library reading the Eugene Kuntz handbooks on habendum clauses and implied and explicit covenants. There's a professor at OU at the time, Owen Anderson, who kind of wrote the modern current case law. And I was just curious. I was curious as to how the oil and gas industry works. How do these contracts, that are, theoretically represent a 6% of the GDP, hundreds of billions of dollars of capex a year.
Yeah.
How do these PSAs work? What are these things? Farm outs? What is an implied explicit covenant? All these types of legal questions. And
So
thankfully.
Do you learn those on your own? Do you have
Well,
help from others?
not. I mean, I certainly did a lot of reading, but yeah, I needed mentors. Fortunately, I had a lot of very generous people in my life that were much older and much smarter and wiser than me. That would, if you ever want to meet with somebody, 6 a.m. is a great time. There's not a lot of people competing for that window. And so I. And also breakfast is really cheap, and so I spent a lot of breakfasts courting people that I could learn from,
Sure.
and built a lot of really great relationships and learned a ton at a young age, and just being curious.
What was your role originally in oil and gas?
Yeah, so my brother-in-law he had worked for there was a private equity group out of Connecticut called Wexford Capital, and he had worked for some of their portfolio companies, and then he had gone out on his own and had some family money that backed him, and he had bought a considerable amount of acreage and operated properties, oil and gas wells. He had a small little wireline business and a small little gathering system. And, he was tragically killed out on site on a well, and my sister had a 2-year-old, was pregnant with her second child.
Oh, geez.
And so, I moved back to Oklahoma after, having no plans to come back to this part of the country. And I needed a job. And, there was this asset that there was nobody there to manage. And, my brother-in-law's family had been in the business for a long time, been very successful. And kind of the patriarch came to me and said, hey, why don't you manage this business? I'll teach you it, kind of baptism by fire. And it was a phenomenal, educational experience.
Yeah, I bet.
So, day one, I'm doing anything from gas balancing to negotiating farm outs and JOAs to trying to put words of grant on a document that probably shouldn't have had words of grant on it. And, not knowing what I was doing at the time, but, when you get the phone calls from an angry counterparty, you learn real quick.
Yeah. Well, so I understand that you now are applying big data to the oil and gas industry. So tell us what
So it's
that
interesting.
evolution.
I got into the business in the early 2000s, 2004, 2005 timeframe, oil and gas that is. And at that time, we saw this revolution of technology as it relates to drilling and completing wells, horizontal drilling, largely here, Barnett Shale, right?
Okay.
At that same time, at Stanford, you saw, these technologists, creating, products like Lex Machina, right? Which is really kind of evolved the patent litigation industry using large language models, using natural language processing. I mean, these technology buzzwords have been around since the 60s. Data has been around since the pocket calculator. Right?
Maybe it would be useful for our audience for you to explain a little bit about that model that you were just telling us about that Stanford developed.
Yeah. So,
what did it do?
well, I mean, I'm not an expert on legal technology at all, but as I understand it, you're talking about case law, which is always evolving, right?
Yes.
But the good thing is it's in written natural language, right?
Yes.
It's in a document. But the problem is it's in a PDF or TIFF, right? Mm-hmm. And there are lots of words on those documents, right?
Yeah.
Well, the beauty of natural language processing, there's a lot that goes into the process, but it starts with the aggregation of images or unstructured information, in this case. Then you have to create characters out of all these little things on the paper, right? So it's just an image, right? It might as well be a cat, right?
Right.
But computers are pretty good at recognizing, well, that's actually an L or a 1 or a 2, depending on the quality of the image, right?
Yes.
So that gets into optic character recognition, right? But a computer doesn't know that DUNHAM is a name,
Right.
right? So it needs some context, right? And you can build that context. And so now we're kind of moving towards this thing called natural language processing, which is where we're taking optical character recognition, which is a bunch of data, and we're starting to provide some context. And now we're starting to identify words and phrases and things, and we're able to structure it in a database.
Okay.
Well, once you're able to structure in a database, you can search it, you can filter it.
Yes.
So to apply it to oil and gas, for example, I'm a big believer that we're going to see a significant increase in the amount of litigation financing for, looking at all of these implied and explicit covenants that are underpin these assets.
Yes.
Like in the Permian Basin, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, it largely is a combination of the language and the natural language in these documents.
Yes.
Combined with the regulatory environment, combined with the outcome, like the production, right?
Yeah.
And that equation is whether or not you have a breach.
Yeah.
Sure.
And that breach could be very expensive.
Sure.
Right. And it's the same thing in patent litigation, right?
So to make this simpler, I think what you're suggesting is, right, you're going to have the ability to take what's currently public records that you'd have to go to the courthouse, the county, otherwise to get, or the railroad commission for some of these. Going to turn it into big data that can be analyzed. And thus, we're no longer relying on a human just randomly happen to have decided, oh, I think they breached. Through data, you'll be AI, whatever, we'll be able to come up with.
Combine things, yes. And so then it's a question of, well, in what way is the judge ruling at that time? Right, because case law is evolving. And that's what Lex Machina was really good at doing, is helping you understand that's a different level of context, right?
Yes.
So like you may have the underlying language that establishes a breach, right?
Yes.
But now you have to understand the variable outcomes depending on rulings, which are very geography specific and other things, right?
So do I understand correctly that one of the pieces of the data in this model would be to take the grants, like the leases themselves, and
Totally.
interpret those?
Absolutely. Because this isn't really big data. Like, and this is my favorite thing about being in markets like Dallas or Houston, where there is some technology here for sure. But the lexicon in this community is a little less developed than it is in San Francisco or New York, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so, when I think about big data, I think about genetics, where there are billions of variations, right? So when I think about a addendum clause in an oil and gas lease, or an implied covenant, explicit duty to produce, drill and produce, or succession and production clauses, you lawyers might write that 100 different ways,
right?
But that's not big data.
That's not big data.
No, it's not.
And it's funny because the objection that you commonly get is there's no way you're going to train a computer to read a document. And I'm like, you guys copy and repeat language all the time. There's very little innovation in your natural language, right?
Yeah.
And then you have, I don't want to get, I believe in a meritocracy, so I might say things that might offend, but then you get landmen that are practicing law, and they maybe shouldn't be, and they are copy and pasting language.
Sure.
Oh, for
and,
sure.
And a legal document is a tapestry. You can't just take one paragraph and insert it, right?
Correct. Yeah.
And so what happens when you do that is you have all sorts of liability, right?
Well, you're pointing to one of the things that Jeremy and I know well. We're both litigators, right? This is one of the things we have issues with transactional lawyers. Actually, not really, because they give us jobs, because they do that all the time. They just use the same language, take it from one contract, but as you point out, without the context of, wait, this doesn't actually fit, because they're borrowed from 5 other contracts.
Absolutely. And context is really important, especially when you get into AI, right? So, and that's one of the limitations of AI, frankly, is it is trained upon a certain amount of information, right? Well, if you train it on the wrong information, it's going to give you the wrong answers.
Certainly.
Right? And so, a lot of people are threatened by AI, and to me, it's just a tool to enable humans, right? It's not there are some jobs, certainly, that are at risk with artificial intelligence, but it's really like an Iron Man suit that you put on a subject matter expert, right?
Exactly.
Because when I ask ChatGPT certain questions and I train it on certain information, it is limited to that perspective, right? And humans are very good at processing new information, which means that perspective is always evolving. Whereas computers, it's binary. It's what's in there right now, right? It's 1 and 0, right? So anyways, but yeah, I think blockchain was the rage. 10 years ago.
Sure.
And we've forgotten it, right? So I'm not saying that ChatGPT and LLM is not certainly exciting, and there isn't all sorts of application. There absolutely is. But with any kind of technology, it's tempered by, what's the problem that you're trying to solve? Do you even need ChatGPT? You might just need Excel.
Sure.
So that leads to an interesting question. You're an entrepreneur. You started, you come out of Duke, immediately get into a field that you had not had an experience with. Then eventually, I know you started your own company, Osberg. So where do you see the future then, as far as what you're going to do and where you think the opportunities are going to come as we move on?
So for me, I believe in doubling down on your strengths and not trying to learn new markets, right? So the things that I've experienced and developed some knowledge around are things like real assets. So I've been on the working interest minerals operating side of the industry. I don't know too much about downstream oil and gas. I know enough to be dangerous on the upstream and the midstream side. I know a little bit about real estate. So real assets kind of in general is an area that I will continue to play in. And then, the intersection between real assets and technology. So I'm always thinking about how to systematize processes, use technology, use data. I think there's a lot of ignorance around data. Like we are so dependent on that data, but we don't really know what that data is, the quality of it, its strengths, its limitations. And that's something that I'm fairly good at judging. And then leveraging that data to buy, sell assets. So I love this notion of systematizing the acquisition of real assets. So what that means is when you look at kind of the, buying and selling real assets, it starts with underwriting. How do you value an asset? Then it starts with deal flow, which can be organic or can be marketed, or there's a number of different variations to deal flow. Really, the acceleration of the deployment of capital is something that's really important to me. Typically I like scenarios where there's too much deal flow and not enough capital, unfortunately.
You know what, Evan, do you mind, just because we don't know who will be watching it? All of us here know what you mean, but when you say deal flow, can you just explain it?
Minerals. So minerals are a market that's really interesting. It's argued to be a $700 billion trillion market, right? Highly fragmented. So if your grandfather owned minerals, when he passed away, you and your parents and their siblings may have inherited those minerals, and then it's gotten increasingly fractionalized over time, right?
Sure. Okay.
But if I want to buy your mineral, I have to go run title, and that transaction cost really doesn't care if you own 1/8 or 1/100th, right?
That's right.
So as we see this huge intergenerational transfer of wealth, as the baby boomers are dying,
Yes.
we're seeing this huge fractionalization of real assets, right? And transaction costs are remaining constant, right? So I'm thinking about how to leverage technology at scale so that I'm positioned to be able to lower those transaction costs as assets are becoming increasingly fractionalized, right? The other problem is that what was 25 net mineral acres is now 1/4 of that, right? I have to make a lot more phone calls and make a lot more transactions to deploy any kind of meaningful capital.
Yes.
Right? So anything north of $50 million in any one basin, is a challenge, right? And a lot of people will say that all the low-hanging fruit is gone. And I can show you a scatter plot of what all the transactions look like. And they're not entirely wrong. The easy stuff is certainly done, gone. But there's a huge swath of the market that has not been aggregated.
Can you give our audience an example of it? How advanced are some of these data tools in that context specifically? If tracking down these mineral interests and owning them, or
everything that I described is a workflow that you could semi-automate. You would never completely. So I'm a big believer in what's called human-in-the-loop development, which is again, it's very much everything pivots around the human, but it's enabling the human. What I love and hate about markets like Dallas is culturally we think of data and technology as a service to our business as opposed to the core competitive advantage of our business. So if I were in New York talking to a hedge fund, I would be talking to you about the number of PhDs in computer science, the amount of servers, the amount of data that you crunch. The first 5 pages of your LP pitch deck would be about your technology advantage, not about your people, not about your macro philosophy or underwriting. It would be the first thing out of your lips. And you would probably have a CTO as a core member of your management team.
Sure.
Right?
You mentioned earlier that the quality of the data matters dramatically.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at. Is that you need, first of all, you need somebody to evaluate that.
That's what I was wondering, because we've always heard in business school we learn garbage in, garbage out.
Absolutely.
Programming, and so if you don't have have good data, and so it sounds like the human's still pretty integral in that process. You mentioned you're good at identifying that. That sounds like that's probably still a human putting their eyes on the data set.
Yeah, I just talked to this group of founders today. They've got a great business doing several million of top line revenue in a really niche market, and they want to scale it, and technology is the obvious solution to scale it.
Yep.
But they don't know how to hire a CTO. They don't know how to evaluate their talents.
Yep.
They don't know how to hire an engineer. So what commonly happens is you reach out to your buddy who's got a nephew that's on the Geek Squad at Best Buy, right? Somebody in this universe of IT, right? It's like going to your neighbor that's a dentist and being like, "Hey man, I got a heart palpitation. Can you help me out here?" Something's not.
Yeah.
It's wrong part of the anatomy, my friend. It's the same thing, and so it is very difficult in markets like this to kind of change culture. But in my opinion, that's both the opportunity and the challenge. And if I'm a management team in any kind of real asset business, the first thing I'm thinking about is who's my chief technologist, and can I trust that individual to be a good leader?
Sure.
Right? He's got to be a core member of the team with a core stake of the business. And changing, I mean, that's where the culture changing starts. Without that, the counter argument is, Evan, I'm on my 9th fund. I'm doing just fine. I've got my citation in the backyard. Like, don't worry about me. I'm going to keep doing what I've been doing. And you know what? There's a valid argument.
Yeah.
But I do think that there's certainly opportunity for people that are thinking a little bit differently.
So, Evan, if I just heard you right, not only are you running your own company still, but are you out there doing consulting and working with others to?
Yeah, I am, and increasingly so.
Sure.
So I have the one thing that ChatGPT has done, GPT, is it's helped the common individual understand what's possible.
Sure.
Right. It's made it a little bit more accessible, and so I think people are a little surprised at the power of these sorts of technologies. And intimidated, frankly.
Sure.
And that makes all the sense in the world. And I think all that's doing is kind of slowly, getting people more open and receptive to what's possible, and that's at least an opener for a conversation.
Sure.
I think increasingly you're going to see people start, taking a little bit of that CapEx budget, a little bit of that G&A, and starting to make some investments. I think there's going to be some frustration there because, again, like, how would you know where to start? Right.
So let me ask you this, though. If somebody's watching this and they think they might need some assistance, like, who's the right person who ought to be calling you and saying, Evan, I think you can help me turn this into...
I mean, I'll talk to anybody.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, I'm a friend to all.
Yeah, there you go.
I mean, like, I'm not here for a marketing point.
No, I know.
Business.
But
Like,
Sure. But where would you add the most value if there was a company considering getting into
it depends on what the problem is.
Yeah.
I mean, like, for the guys that I just got the phone with on the way over here, like, literally, like, they needed to they thought that their problem was around the technology. And as I talked through what their business model was, their problem wasn't around the technology. The problem was around the supplier, like, and really understanding the problems of the supplier, right?
Okay.
So, like, technology is just a tool. And technology, most of the time, is about scaling more than anything. But oftentimes, like the problem can be way more, bigger than just technology. It's where do you put technology?
Sure.
So then let's switch gears because I know that you've been, as you already said, you've been interested in law at least since you were in college.
Yep.
You and I have spent time talking about strategies, how law works. So what is it that intrigues you so much about law?
Well, I mean, it's an instrument. First of all, there's 4 corners of a document that are open to interpretation. Like, I'm a creative. I love that. Like I've written crazy things into a document because you can. And I like this market dynamic of a willing buyer and a willing seller. I never obfuscate things. Like, I'll say, hey, you should probably read this paragraph. And I think that's good business.
Yes.
But at the end of the day, it's up to you. Like, I'm not going to advocate for you. Like, it's up to you to decide whether or not you're willing to accept those terms or not, right? So, like, I mean, I like the concept of transactions. I like, kind of this free market economy. And I don't know. I very much view the law as a tool, right? Then there are some things about law that just are intellectually, interesting to me, like just the emotional versus logical and rational dynamic, right? So, like, I see that a lot. Like, I've been a party to it. Yeah. I also have consulted for people that, there's a management team out of Austin, Texas, that's funded by a litigation finance group out of San Francisco. And they're taking on some very large customers or clients, they're not clients, counterparties.
Yeah.
There's just a lot of strategy involved, right?
And I think you're talking about in like kind of the resolution process in litigation and how, in theory, it should be a business transaction a lot of times because you've got a certain amount you're spending versus what you can recover. A lot of theatrics, a lot of motion. And so it's a market in a way, but it's one that's really distorted by a lot of these external
There's
factors.
a lot of qualitative factors, right? It's not as quantitative as you might think it would be. And so, things like, finding the right experts and the fact that most of the experts are taken up, and that's a strategic move, right? Even if they're being utilized or not.
Sure.
Right?
Yep.
My dad is a Native American history expert, and he's in all sorts of cases right now, around, interpreting, treaties and things like that. There are these strategies, that have, that are purely qualitative, and I'm sure somebody could model out, make them more quantitative, but like, it's just fascinating to me, and it can be really frustrating too. Like the legal process in of itself, especially when you're dealing with irrational actors, like it can be incredibly frustrating.
Yes,
Yeah.
for sure.
No doubt.
We know.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's just been something that I've observed, been a party to, and has just been, fascinating on many different levels. Like, for example, I think I was asking Dunham the other day, how many cases actually settle?
Yes.
And I think you were saying all of them.
Well, 90-something%, yes.
And so the question is, I mean, if your goal is to resolve them as fast as possible, what is the best path to take, right?
Yeah, and a lot of that, as we discussed, depends on the psychology of the opponent.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I was talking to you about is how do you shake somebody out of this emotional state and bring them into some level of rationality, right? So it's very, and I've read a lot about, the limbic system versus, the cerebral cortex, and, you get emotionally hijacked, right? And so oftentimes, you can be speaking plain English and thinking that you're the most rational and logic person in the world, but everything's coming from an emotional place.
Yeah.
Where that train has left the station and you're not stopping it.
Yeah, and there's efforts in the law. A lot of times we'll try things like early mediations or try to get interventions with a third party to try to outline this stuff for some people, and sometimes that works. But a lot of times, people just have to see it through because they're so emotionally invested in that case and they're convinced they're going to win.
Yep.
Well, as Evan and I were discussing about this, right? The problem with, as you and I know, early mediation sounds great. It sounds like, oh, we'll just sit down and we'll have a mediation and we'll skip all the cost, all the angst. And as you and I know, it almost never works. And it almost never works because at the beginning of any case, both sides are fully emotionally invested. Even though you may be representing a Fortune 100 company, it's still run by human beings. And human beings are angry, they're upset, you've hurt their feelings, they feel like they've been cheated. All those things are still raw.
Yep.
And so you're not in a perfectly rational spot. And at that point, still both sides believe in their principle that they're 100% right.
Yep.
And thus they're unwilling to budge. And unfortunately, as we discussed, what really happens then is both sides need to spend a lot of money.
Yeah,
on
absolutely.
lawyers.
I mean, that tends to separate people up.
And then it sobers them up.
Either that or put ice plunges outside the office.
And as I tell many, many people, I honestly believe if you sat down early in a case and the two lawyers could speak frankly to each other, they could predict what it was going to settle at, and they could settle it between themselves right then and there.
Yeah.
But the clients won't. They're not in
right.
that space.
So here's a tough question. How do you better align incentives between lawyers and clients? It's the same question you ask about, aligning incentives with a subcontractor, while building a house. It's doing cost plus or something, right? So that's a question that's another intellectual question I've always, thought of is for example, let's talk about technology and the services business within oil and gas. Brokers, okay? Brokers are out, they get paid a day rate, okay? Yep. So they're incentivized to spend more days, okay, doing a project. So one of the things that I've talked to some brokers about is I can support you with some technology that I can literally qualitatively show you will reduce the time that you spend by at least 80%, okay? Provide a much better product that's higher quality, okay? So diligencing a transaction, okay? 20,000 documents that would take you, a year and $2 million, I can have done in 3 months guaranteed with every clause extracted, already going into a land management system for a fraction of the cost, okay? Why don't you do a project-based deal where there's higher margin and you're consistently delivering a better product, right?
I think that those would be, look, obviously, anywhere you can build efficiencies into what lawyers do, I'm all for, right? And we're not, Dunham and I strongly believe that we're about tailored, customized approach that gets the client where they need to get to, right? For the least amount of money possible. But one of the problems that I see with a model where it's based on a flat compensation is that it actually skews the incentives.
Sure.
Because now the client doesn't have any incentive to settle, right? And that doesn't mean that you need the lawyers to make more money to make them settle. That's not what I'm suggesting at all. But I mean, but in terms of solving that dilemma that you're talking about, changing the compensation model doesn't necessarily. It just pushes it perhaps onto the attorney, or pushes it onto them to, like for example, if you did a flat rate on a case and said, look, I'm going to handle this for you for X dollars all the way through, that client's got zero incentive to settle that case at that point, unless just purely, am I going to lose or not, right? And they can drag the other side through the mud. So it's an interesting concept, and I think it's one that the lawyers in the legal field probably ought to spend some time thinking about. But the answer is not not obvious.
Well, I also think the whole legal field is about to change dramatically in the form of, as we were talking about, we now can use AI to do the work of an associate.
Right.
So now the associates, which is a big portion of the business model for a law firm, the larger law firms, right? Associates do all the doc review, all this stuff. They're cranking out hours, they're cranking out billables. In many ways now, they're going to get displaced. And then it's going to be interesting. We're going to be back into a very old system, I think, where you'll end up as a young attorney being like a young doctor. You're not making much money. You're learning how to become a senior and not getting paid, because right now young associates are making over $200,000 a year at some of these big firms, right? I think that model is about to be substantially disrupted. They've been predicting it for a very long time, but now we're starting to see the products that will help actually get that done, including doc review. AI can do some doc review, but there will always be a distinction, I think, between what they call bespoke litigation, very, very high end, and then the average, normal, write a basic contract, do insurance defense litigation. It's going to change dramatically. I think,
and then there's the question: how many lawyers have actually been before a judge?
Yes.
Yeah.
Which percentage is that, right?
Well, it goes down every year, right? Because as we get further and further from the 80s or something, you'll end up with less and less people who have familiarity, which is why in some large law firms today, you will see them actively recruiting litigation or trial lawyers at the highest stages of the partnership, even though they may not have clients, because these just don't exist. There aren't that many people anymore who've spent much time in a courtroom.
Yep.
I think the other thing, following up on your analysis of the things, it's not, we talk about money being one of the things kind of wears people down, but that's not the only thing. The emotional investment in the case.
Oh, absolutely.
And going through the litigation, it's not
but people grossly underestimate that. It's like when I try to make a value proposition around time.
Yeah.
Like I'll ask somebody if this increases your throughput by 10%, what's that worth to you? Like, nobody knows how to quantify their time.
Yeah. No,
except for lawyers that bill hourly.
well, yeah, I guess so.
Quantify. Not quantify.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. I tell clients that all the time. If cost aside, okay, you've got the resources, you can see those through. Do you want to be spending your time thinking about this case, living with this case, living with this case, and those things at the beginning? It's absolutely, no problem. I'll see it through, and they don't understand the emotional toll that takes. Time. And so sometimes you have to get to that.
So for me, like what I'm looking for from lawyers more, and I think I communicated this to you guys early on when we were getting to know one another, is I'm looking for collaborators, right? So like I certainly have like intuition, some experience to dictate, how I'd like things to go, right? But I'm not looking for an attorney that's going to just say yes, sir, and get right to work on that. Like educate me throughout the process. Like what am I missing? And let's collaborate and get to the outcomes that we're trying to get to together. To me, like there's a lot of residual value in that, right? So like when I go round 2, 3, and 4, right, I'm drawing upon that, right?
Yes. Right, Dunham and I think, we strongly believe in that, and we take the counselor part of our role seriously, and that's part of what we think that, and I think not a lot of lawyers do that, but not enough do it well, really setting out the options for their clients.
And unfortunately, we're running out of time here, but just one last thing, is there anything that you want to cover that we didn't cover briefly? About law, about data?
I mean, not in particular. I mean, I think. I think my interest is largely around like systematizing real assets. I think as it relates to like the legal themes that are around that, people are always looking for passive liquidity, right?
Sure.
And so, like just take oil and gas, where you could argue that it's not a lot of new development, new fields, right? Everything's held by production, right? Well, everything's also held by these 30-page contracts that somebody negotiated and put into a file drawer and hasn't looked at in I don't know how many years, right?
Right, sure.
And so mineral owners, if they're not getting liquidity through royalty checks because you're not constantly drilling, you may have drilled your one well and have moved on from there. Not every mineral owner is going to have the money or the wherewithal to hire an attorney to pursue something like that.
Yeah.
But there are people that are going to be looking for those opportunities increasingly, particularly when you're using these types of technologies that can read through these documents in a fraction of a second.
Sure.
And summarize key terms. And once you get that structured data and can combine it with other data sets, like you're starting to create workflows to identify like thousands of leases that are in breach and things like that. So
That's great. Well, Evan, this has been a really interesting conversation.
Sure. Enjoyed it.
Really
Thanks for having
appreciate you
me.
being here.
Thanks for joining us. And this has been the best of the best, brought to you by Biles Wilson.